Welcome to Calm Historian. Tonight, we step into the roaring heart of ancient Rome, where dust arose like smoke, steel flashed in sunlight, and the fate of men hung on a gesture. But behind the thunder of the crowd and the clash of blades lies a quieter truth, one of pain, ambition, and the strange dignity of those who lived and died for spectacle. Take a breath, settle in, and walk with us into the arena, where history remembers and questions. Before we begin, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? It always amazes us how far history can travel, and if you enjoy stories told slowly and thoughtfully, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps more than you know. They were the storm at the center of Rome's spectacle, figures of steel and scar moving across a sea of sand beneath a vault of cheering, jeering faces. Gladiators occupied a strange, paradoxical place in the life of the empire. Part idol, part object, a living pageant of courage and brutality that filled the great amphitheaters, the Colosseum towering above them as the most famous of all. On a bright day, the arena felt like another world. Marble tiers climbed like the steps of some living mountain. Banners snapped in a hot wind, and the crowd pressed around the rim as if drawn to watch fate made visible. Into that sand, the fighters walked with measured steps, each life exposed and open to judgment. Their work, if it can be called a craft, was perilous beyond measure. This was a profession where a single clash could mean more than defeat. It could mean death. The man who staged the games, the organizer or dignitary who had summoned the spectacle, held enormous power in his hand. In the charged silence after a bout, he could decide whether a loser would be ended or spared, and that decision could be a grim gamble, a political gesture, a mercy granted for applause or withheld to satisfy the crowd's appetite for finality. The arena was theater, law, and a brutal stage for the exercise of public will all at once. Most of these fighters, and they were overwhelmingly men, wore chains before they wore laurel. Gladiators were nearly always slaves, taken from farms, snatched in foreign wars, sold out of households. They were bought, trained, and in many cases denied the freedom of choice. The word gladiator evokes skill and spectacle, but it also carries the hard truth of compulsory servitude. People turned into instruments of entertainment by a society that admired their prowess while owning their bodies. To live as a gladiator was to exist on a narrow margin between demonstration and doom. And yet, the picture is not one-sided. Alongside those forced into the sand stood others who walked there by choice. Free men, and the occasional free woman, sometimes picked up sword and shield for reasons that surprised their contemporaries and complicate our view. Ambition, the hunger for renown, the craving for applause. These motives could lead a free citizen into the arena not as a victim, but as a seeker of fame. For some, the games offered the clearest route to recognition in a society with little social mobility. Scars and triumphs granted a strange kind of celebrity. A name could echo beyond the blood-stained earth into the memory of the city. History resists single answers. When we look at the gladiator, we do not see only the man in armor. We see our own anxieties and values reflected back. For modern listeners, the spectacle raises immediate, painful ethical questions. We ask sharply how a society could cheer while spilling blood. We count in our heads the lives extinguished for entertainment. How many innocent people died, how many hopes were crushed. Even inside the cavernous Colosseum there hangs an unspoken ledger of pain and bravery that cannot be neatly tallied. And yet there were moments in the arena that defied calculation. Brief human instants when a fighter's courage could quiet the crowd, when the taut line between life and death was played with something like honor. The gladiator's life was threaded with contradiction, valor and subjugation, spectacle and sacrifice, the brief warmth of applause beside the long chill of ownership. To listen to their story is to feel the sand underfoot, to hear the murmur swell into a roar, to imagine the flash of sun on polished metal, and the hush when a decision was about to fall. These men, and, in smaller numbers, the women who stood beside them, were not mere figures in a show. They were individuals with fears and ambitions, thrust together by a society that made meaning from their struggle. Their lives force us to reckon with the past, not as a list of dates and deeds, but as a human drama, messy and morally complicated. Standing apart from that ancient noise, we find ourselves asking who tells history and to whom, which acts are remembered and which are excused. The arena's sand has long since been swept clean, but its echoes remain, asking us to listen closely and to hold the image of the gladiator, warrior, slave, sometimes superstar. In a light that is never simple, never wholly comfortable, and never easily forgotten. Long before Rome raised its great stone theaters and turned spectacle into the rhythm of empire, the first stirrings of the gladiatorial world grew out of the shadowed rites of Italy's older fighting peoples. On a hilltop at dusk, families would gather beneath pine and cypress, while smoke from offerings threaded up into a violet sky. In those Etruscan and other Italic communities, combat was part of the language of honor and of grief. A man cut down in battle, or a noble whose line had ended, was sent off with the display of arms. Warriors met in ritual combat to settle questions of courage and to accompany the dead into whatever lay beyond, and the clash of bronze and the steady beat of drums sounded as both tribute and warning. From those intimate, graveside ceremonies, the spectacle reached into the life of the growing Roman city. What had been a solemn duty, the munus, an offering to the dead, changed as crowd and circumstance enlarged it, becoming louder, brighter, and public. The cramped ritual space opened into a sandy arena built to hold a swelling audience of townspeople, magistrates, and wealthy patrons. Gladiators, at first warriors and then captured soldiers, slaves and volunteers trained for combat, faced one another in contests whose rules and costumes shifted with each generation. Sometimes they met one-on-one. Sometimes they were pitted against wild beasts or condemned men, producing a theater of danger that tested skill, endurance, and fate. As these contests moved from private tombs to the city's heart, they wove themselves into Roman life. The blast of trumpets and the rattle of armor marked not only entertainment but civic display. Magistrates and emperors staged games to honor gods, to celebrate victories, or to curry popular favor, and vast amphitheaters, tears curling up like a carved hillside, took in the roar of thousands. Schools arose to train men as spectacles. Armor and weapons were standardized into striking types. The whole enterprise matured into a polished, brutal art. In that transformation you can hear both the echo of ancestral mourning and a new, insistent voice. A society that used pageantry and peril to bind itself together, to grieve and to celebrate, and to be shaped by the sight of human courage displayed for the city's gaze. They didn't come into the arena by accident or by whim. They were chosen. Men, and sometimes others, were picked out of whatever ordinary life they had, tested not only for sheer strength, but for temperament, grit, and the kind of talent a trainer could shape into a particular way of fighting. Once selected, their days belonged to one relentless aim, learning how to survive where body met blade. The training was exacting, uncompromising. The compound became a world of drilling and repetition, where every movement was worn until it could be done without thinking. They learned a full catalog of skills. Different fighting styles meant different stances, different footwork, different timings, and each technique had to be practiced until it worked, as if on instinct. They learned to shape their bodies, to build agility alongside raw strength, to read an opponent's weight and intent, to move with a mix of speed and control. The work was strictly practical, endurance and timing, turning a parry into advantage, making one precise action decide a dangerous moment. Every drill had a purpose, sharpening reflexes, forging coordinated motion, hardening the will so exhaustion would not feel like surrender. All of this happened inside the Ludus, a school nothing like the quiet gyms of later times. These places had the discipline and order of military camps, arranged to make fighters of novices and to keep them ready at all times. The Ludus was half sports complex, half living quarters, practice grounds and sparring rings rubbing up against sleeping rooms where the gladiators actually lived. Open courtyards for training, small rooms for rest and recovery, corridors where the smell of sweat and oil mixed with dust from 1,000 footsteps. That was the daily scene. Day after day they trained together, ate together, nursed wounds together. A regimen had to be kept, hierarchies obeyed, and there was no room for indulgence. The work itself was often far from glamorous. Long hours of repetition built not just skill, but a muscle memory that would take over when fear tried to seize a man's limbs. Conditioning increased stamina and taught fighters how to keep moving when every part of them begged to stop. Agility drills kept the feet light and the body ready to twist away from a strike. Combat moves were refined in paired practice, under the eye of a trainer who corrected a posture, adjusted a grip, or punished a careless motion. There was pain, bruises, scraped hands, aching shoulders. And there was pride in the small improvements that could be the difference between victory and a grievous wound. Modern pictures of gladiators sell a glossy myth. Chiseled, perpetually ripped warriors. That image is a simplification that masks the real, practical truth. Many gladiators carried a layer of fat over their bodies. Their plain, repetitive diet of barley and vegetables produced a protective padding. That extra flesh wasn't vanity. It acted as armor, cushioning blows and keeping sharp edges from reaching vital organs, nerves, and major vessels. Those few added seconds could turn a fatal cut into a wound that might heal. But the trade-off was real. The diet that built that protective layer didn't give enough calcium for men whose bones were constantly battered. Their solution was blunt and pragmatic, a tonic made from the ashes of burned wood and bones. Bitter and gritty, it provided minerals that the rest of their food lacked and became part of the routine. Swallowed during training or recovery, by men who understood the fragile balance between immediate survivability and long-term health. So a gladiator's life was a blend of hard discipline and practical adaptation. The ludus shaped both body and mind through repetition, strict supervision, and a communal intensity that bound the men to one another. Their bodies and their food were calculated responses to an unforgiving job, and even the strange remedies served a clear, survival-minded purpose. In those enclosed courtyards and sleeping cells, amid the clang of practice and the quiet mending of wounds, these fighters were forged, not the one-dimensional icons of our fascination, but trained, conditioned human beings whose survival depended on a precise mix of skill, endurance, and hard-won wisdom. Dust hung in the oven-like air of the amphitheater, and beneath it, the city's hunger for spectacle slowly boiled and quickened. The arena was never just a stage. It was a place of sharp contrasts, where skill and courage were set to the unforgiving light of day. Gladiators did not arrive as a single idea, but as characters with a costume and a method. One built for reach and speed, another for crushing, close work. One who trusted a heavy rope net and a long trident. Another who relied on a broad shield and a thick, enclosing helmet. Each style carried its own promise and peril, a visible strength that could win the crowd's roar and an exposed weakness that could be turned against him with lethal ease. You could read a man's story at a glance. Leather straps crossing a chest, the flash of a short sword, the curve of a helmet crest. Some wore a metal greave on one leg and left the other bare so footwork stayed light. Others moved slowly under layered protection, a living wall of iron and intent. Those choices were not mere showmanship. They were the grammar of the fight. Trainers and promoters matched opponents to make qualities face off. Reach against armor, speed against mass, agility against defense. And that opposition is what kept every bout unpredictable and riveting. Because the Romans wanted danger to be plain to see, much of a fighter's body remained deliberately exposed. Plates, helmets, and shields guarded the vital places, but arms, thighs, and the soft belly were often left open. That exposed flesh is why the crowd leaned forward. A clean thrust or a perfectly timed cut could tear through skin and muscle and pour a terrible, immediate truth into the sand. Wounds were part of the story. They turned spectacle into a contest where blood and breath were on the line. To keep the balance, organizers rarely put two of the exact same type against one another. Like a chess match in flesh, each bout posed a tactical question. Would the lightly armed man keep his distance and use reach and trickery, or would the heavily armored fighter force the close, grinding engagement? The answers arrived in sand and sweat, in short explosive bursts of violence that decided the day. Few matchups captured the public imagination more clearly than the retiarius and the secutor. The retiarius fought as a netman, carrying a coarse rope net and a long-pointed trident, moving, feinting, and using reach to shape the fight. He wore little metal, his shoulders and torso open to the sun, which made him quick but dangerously exposed if the net failed. Facing him was the secutor, a ponderous figure in a smooth enclosed helmet and heavy shield, built to close distance and smother the retiarius's advantages. The secutor's armor turned him into a blunt instrument of collision. The retiarius's kit made him a kind of living snare. When they met, the arena became a study in tactics, a net cast and hauled, a chase that tested endurance as much as skill. The crowd understood these subtleties, They came not only for blood, but for the drama of mismatch and mastery. For a fighter who could make technicalities fall away and reveal something human. Distance danced with grace, a sudden flurry of bone-deep blows, a clever evasion that turned weakness into cunning. For the listeners in the stands, each clash was a small human epic, where equipment and training, fear and calculation converged. Every scrape and heavy breath added to the story until the sand was stained and the winter's shadow lay long across the arena. So the spectacle kept going, a procession of distinct types, a parade of specialized weapons and armor, the deliberate exposure of flesh to remind everyone of what was at stake, and carefully chosen matchups that pitted strengths against weaknesses. That variety, the certainty of difference and the promise of decisive contrasting encounters, is what kept the games alive, turning them into stories told in blood and bronze beneath a relentless sun. When the crowd hushed and the sand in the arena settled beneath his sandals, the secutor stepped forward with the steady inevitability of pursuit. He was the heavy swordsman of the amphitheater, built and bred for one thing, to close the distance and end the darting, awkward dance of his opponent. His armor announced him before he spoke, a mass of metal and leather that absorbed blows and carried the threat of a direct, uncompromising attack. The helmet was a study in brutal, functional design. A smooth, rounded dome, fitted with a visor that hid most of his face, the eye slits narrow and hard, made not for spectacle, but for survival. Behind that visor his eyes watched and waited, the limited view forcing him to trust timing, posture, and the steady beat of his own heart. Across his forearm, thigh, and sometimes his torso, he wore the accoutrements expected of a gladiator who aimed to meet contact. An arm guard for his sword arm, greaves on his legs, a belt, and layers of leather or metal that turned blades into dull surprises. In his left hand he gripped a large rectangular shield, broad enough to cover his torso, heavy enough to be a moving wall, curved to take a spear's point or shrug off a stinging flurry while still permitting the short, brutal strikes he favored. His sword rested in his right hand, kept close to the body. Short and lethal, it was made for stabbing and cutting at the cramped ranges where reach counted for nothing. Secutor means the pursuer, and the name was no accident. Where lighter, net-wielding adversaries sought to tease and elude, his method was simple, forward motion. He fed on the space between fighters, turning a dodged thrust into a predictable line and using his weight and momentum to close and pin. In the roar of the amphitheater, his approach spoke plainly. Come within range, and the secutor would be there. Shield first, blade ready, eyes hidden but unrelenting. He stepped onto the sand, as if the shoreline lived in his bones. Quick, watchful, ready to move the instant it mattered. The retaliarius was a fisherman turned into a gladiator, an emblem of nets and tides walking into the amphitheater. His shape didn't match the hulking, helmeted figures the crowd loved to see topple. He wore a single piece of metal, the gallerus, curved over his left shoulder and rimmed to deflect glancing blows to his neck and face. It caught the light and flashed, a small, deliberate shield for a man who valued freedom of movement above all else. Coiled at his shoulder, the reti, the net, was his principal tool, carried like a sleeping serpent, a web of rope that could suddenly bloom and seek to tangle the limbs of a larger opponent. In his other hand, he held the long, three-pronged shaft of the trident, rigid and clinical, its points meant to keep a fight at arm's length. An instrument of reach, precision, and delay. Tucked near his hip sat a short dagger, the last refuge when nets failed and distance closed. A compact blade for the brutal intimacy of a grapple. His approach was choreography and calculation, rather than brute force. He moved across the sand with the sort of footwork that looked like a dance. A feint, a quick sidestep, the snap of a net launched to disrupt balance. Then the patient use of the trident to prod, to threaten, to forbid approach. He stayed light on his feet, taking the blows he could not avoid with the Galeris or by a swift retreat, always watching for the exact instant to snare an arm or a leg and turn a heavier man's weight against him. When the net found purchase and ropes closed around a wrist, the trident hunted for a gap. When an adversary closed in, the dagger would flash. There was a quiet cunning to his movements, the calm of someone who knew how to wait for advantage, who trusted timing and reach more than bulky armor. That contrast made him riveting to watch, not merely a brute, but a performer of skill, a fisherman who threw his tools with the same economy and decisiveness he would use at sea. In the heat of the arena, with dust rising and voices swelling, the Retiarius moved with a rhythm born of water, patient, sudden, elusive, his Galeris and implements as much a part of him as the sweat and sand that marked the day's contest. They called him the Murmiglio, and the name already smelled of salt and surf. His helmet crowned with a fish, the crest worked into metal so precisely it looked like a living thing frozen mid-leap. When he turned his head, that crest caught the sun and threw back a wet, bright flash, a small, hard promise. Beneath the polished metal sat the skill and resolve of a man who had either chosen or been chosen to meet fate in the sand. He moved under heavy weight. The helmet hugged his skull and narrowed his world to two thin slits of sight, while a broad rectangular shield, the scutum, sat against his left arm like a wall, its flat face ready to take a blow or shove an opponent back. At his side hung the gladius, short and deadly, made for the close, ordered violence of the arena, and leather straps, greaves, a braced arm added to the armor's bulk, each piece worn smooth by practice and the scars of earlier fights. When the crowd swelled and the gates yawned open, he didn't rush. The Murmiglio's style was deliberate and disciplined, his body taught to turn with the shield and find the tiny openings inside an enemy's guard. He usually faced a secutor, another heavy-armed man built for single-minded pursuit, and the two met like tide against reef. Heavy footfalls, shields clashing, blows traded in a tight, dangerous rhythm. The spectators held their breath for those moments, the fish on his helm flashing, the gladius flicking bright, the unbroken plane of the scutum moving like a line on the sand. More than the name or the kit, it was courage and determination that defined him. Under the harsh glare of the arena, with the sand caked to sweat and voice and hope, he stood steady. He wasn't after showmanship. He wanted the clean business of combat, the small decisive inch when a practiced shield shifted and a life's work paid off. That calm, the refusal to be hurried or thrown, was what people remembered. The fesh on his helm, and the man who held his ground, relentless and sure, until the last shout faded and the sand settled once more. When the Thrax stepped into the arena's blinding light, he looked like a study in purpose and contrast. There was no ponderous rectangular scutum to hide behind, and no heavy frame dragging him down. His kit was compact and exact. A polished helmet obscured his features but left his eyes sharp and visible. A small parmula hugged his arm. A short, single-edged curved psyche rested at his hip, and a bronze ochrea was strapped to his lower leg. Each piece answered a clear need, and together they made him quick, deliberate, and dangerous. The helmet was more than ornament. It framed his face while taking the first shocks. The sudden roar of the crowd, the glancing clip of a blade, so his gaze could stay steady. The parmula, small and mobile, gave him a narrow defense without slowing his feet, letting him shift, feint, and move with precise timing. The Saka's inward curve did what heavier blades could not. It slipped around larger shields to reach ribs, the exposed throat, the soft places a slower, broader style left open. The ochrea protected the limb a fleet fighter could not afford to lose. A single crippling blow there would end his movement and his chances. In the dust and heat of the arena, that equipment came alive. He moved, as if he'd learned to read his opponent the way a hunter reads a trail. Starting low, teasing an opening, inviting a strike with that small shield, then stepping forward before the crowd could finish its roar. The Sika flashed in a clean arc, hunting the narrow gaps left by a bigger man's guard. When an opponent lunged with brute force, he answered with angled defense, and a counter that punished the brief exposure. When they overextended, he slipped aside and let the bronze greave take a stray scrape that might otherwise have crippled him. Every element of his kit balanced protection with speed. There was an intimacy to watching a fighter who traded heavy armor for agility. Every twitch could reveal intent. Every breath was part of a plan. The Thraex didn't merely try to survive. He shaped the fight, turning an adversary's weight and momentum against him. The crowd read that contest of motion and mind. The quick footwork, the keen eyes behind the helm, the small shield that could seem insignificant until it decided a life. In that sand and heat, his compact kit and swift methods told a simple truth. In a world of heavy shields and slow advances, speed and precision could be lethal, and a well-placed curved blade, a nimble shield, and a single sturdy greave were sometimes all a man needed to leave the arena alive. When the provocator stepped from the shadowed gate into the white glare of the arena, the crowd inhaled as if something had taken their breath. He was, above all else, a creature of motion. Every step measured and ready to change, every held pause loaded with the possibility of a sudden lunge. Sunlight skimmed the clean lines of his armor, and for a heartbeat, man and metal became one trembling statement of purpose. His breastplate sat heavy and sure across his chest, a protective curve that kept his center safe while still letting him twist and breathe. It was built with subtle hinges and overlapping plates, not for ornament, but for the way they moved together, catching and releasing light whenever he shifted his weight. Under that mail and folded protection, his body remembered 1,000 repetitions. The pivot, the embarrassed step back, turned into a feint, the quiet catch of balance before a strike. In his hands, he held weapons that balanced offense and defense, a long, probing blade to test a rival's armor and a shorter, sharper implement for the close work that finished a fight. He could press forward with a measured tap, meant only to find a flaw, then fall away and meet a heavy swing with a perfect parry. Watching him was like watching strategy take breath and form. an argument made with limbs, timing, and an unhurried sort of cleverness. Against bigger, heavier gladiators, his skills mattered most. Where sheer force could only crash against resistance, his timing and technique found small, telling seams. He baited with a smile and read the tiniest shift in stance, then exploited that mistake with a patience that felt almost surgical. People who came expecting nothing more than raw power left with a new respect for craft, for a man who made defense feel like choreography and turned the arena into a place where cunning could stand toe-to-toe with strength. The gates ground open, and the Roman sun poured into the arena, and it wasn't just the weight of the sand or the roar of the crowd that signaled a spectacle. It was the sight of a figure who moved with the quickness of twin lightning bolts. He cut a shape, unlike the familiar silhouettes of other fighters, where most gladiators carried a single blade or a sword and shield. He stepped onto the sand with two swords, one in each hand, and that simple, startling difference changed every moment of a fight. Even a casual glance left an impression. The flash of steel, the quick alternation of strike and guard, the uncanny symmetry of two blades, answering and initiating in perfect balance, because his weapons demanded an entirely different rhythm. A single gladius invites a steady pattern: step, thrust, parry, repeat. But the dual arcs of his blades brought danger from unexpected quarters, and watching him felt like watching a storm that could break from any direction. Those twin swords let him weave assaults that cut through an opponent's defenses, drawing the eye and wearing down reflexes until mistakes came not by brute force alone, but by sheer exhaustion of attention. He did not move light-heartedly. The Dimachorus was usually heavily armed, layered in protections that softened the blow of any counterstroke. Protective gear, chest armor, padding that caught glances and swallowed impact. And that armor let him trade a shield for the freedom to use both hands. That balance, the weight of metal against the freedom to move, was part of the spectacle. It demanded confidence, strength, and a special kind of training to make two swords a single, coherent weapon, instead of two unwieldy sticks. On the sand, every pass became a lesson in geometry. One blade sliced to distract, while the other pressed, where attention slackened. He feinted high, then plunged low, crossed lines to expose an elbow or a throat. The crowd leaned forward as the fight sped up. His uneven rhythm made timing treacherous, and opponents found themselves undone not only by force, but by the mental fatigue of defending against so many angles. For all those reasons, the Dimachorus was both a formidable opponent and a source of endless fascination, heavily armored, yet mobile, methodical, yet wildly unpredictable. In the arena's golden glare, his two blades moved with dangerous precision, and when the dust settled and the cheers faded, he was the image that lingered longest in the memory of those who had seen a combat unlike any other. When the Hoplomachus stepped into the sand of the amphitheater, he arrived not as a raw brawler, but as an echo of the Hellenic phalanx come to life. A Corinthian helmet with its sharp forward visor threw his face into shadow. A bronze breastplate clung to his chest, and the molded muscles and carved scars on that armor met the single greave that protected one leg. A small round shield hung before him, compact and hard-edged, designed for quick parries rather than the wide, embracing defense Romans favored. In his hands, He held a long spear, the tool of his trade, while a short sword rested at his side for the intimate work that followed when the gap closed. There was a ritual to the way he moved, not a mad charge, but the careful steadiness of a sentinel, foot set, hips turned, spear leveled. The crowd's roar rose and fell around him as he used spear and shield together, keeping enemies at the tip of his iron point, while the little buckler took and redirected blows. He worked with patience, probing with the spear's tip to read balance and breath, testing angles and forcing openings instead of throwing a single, reckless stroke. When the chance finally came, the short sword slipped free like a precise, economical instrument, less a replacement for the spear than the finishing note of a careful plan. He was trained to suggest the Greek hoplite, not to copy the phalanx blindly, but to turn that discipline into a one-on-one fight. His defense was intimate. A shield that turned a glancing blow, a spear pivoted to shepherd an opponent's weight, a breastplate and helmet that turned fear into steadiness. Against men like the Murmillo, with his broad, commanding shield and heavier blade, the Hoplomachus became a study in contrast. Where the Murmillo sought to close distance and overwhelm with mass, the Hoplomachus used reach and timing to foil those advances, trimming the enemy's choices until a single precise strike decided the match. In the glare of sun and dust, he looked somehow out of time and utterly professional, a Greek idea dressed for Roman spectacle, moving with the economy of someone who understands that survival and glory comes from control, not chaos. The amphitheater light picked out the polished bronze of his helmet and the shallow dents on his shield, each mark a lesson earned. Standing there, spear leveled and shield poised, he proved something old in a new arena. That restraint and skill, shown boldly for all to see, can be as dramatic and as deadly as any furious assault. The gates of the arena groaned open, and a lone horse thundered out beneath the Mediterranean sun, the rider cutting a lean silhouette against the swirl of dust and the roaring crowd. He was the Eques, a mounted gladiator whose life was shaped by movement and balance, by a partnership that made horse and rider behave like one. He rode with the quiet certainty of someone who could feel the animal through every stride. Leaning with it as it curved around the amphitheater, every shift of weight and rhythm answered instantly. In his hand he carried a long spear that caught the light. Sometimes that spear was his only obvious weapon. Sometimes a short blade or small shield hung at his side. Choices made to amplify reach and the sweeping momentum of the mount, rather than the blunt protection of heavy armor. Unlike the heavy helmeted fighters who pounded the sand in clanking metal, the Eques wore light, sparing protection designed not to slow horse or rider. A leather cuirass, a greave on the left leg to guard the stirrup leg, perhaps an arm guard. These were deliberate compromises so he could dart in and out of danger. Everything about his dress announced one priority: agility. He didn't want to stand and absorb blows. He wanted to avoid them, to thrust from a moving vantage, strike clean, and be gone. Facing him on the sand might be a retiarius, almost the inverse of his style. Bare of heavy armor, carrying a net and a long three-pronged spear, the retiarius moved with deceptive lightness and kept a small dagger for desperate moments. No closed helmet or big shield protected him. Instead, he relied on reach, trickery, and the sudden entangling sweep of the net to turn freedom of movement into advantage. Where the equus had speed and the high ground of a mount, the retiarius trusted footwork and cunning. When they met, the arena became a study in contrast. The horse's hooves drummed a steady percussion as rider and mount wheeled and feinted, while the lighter man on the sand twitched and timed his cast, measuring the distance for a trident throw. The eques tried to keep the fight at an angle and a pace where his spear could find its mark, before a net could snare a leg, or the trident could reach. The retiarius, by contrast, invited missteps, baiting the horse until the rider's weight shifted at just the wrong moment. The moment a net could fly, and the trident could finish what the net began. Crowds loved these encounters as much for their theater as for their danger. The bouts set speed against steadiness, horseback against barefooted guile, long reach against sudden wit. They boiled down a dozen tiny choices: how much to trust a mount, when to close, when to feint, into a single tense narrative in sand and sweat. The eques and the retiarius, different in gear and temperament, completed one another in spectacle, one embodying the raw romance of mounted thrust and outward momentum, the other the art of evasion and quick entrapment. Together they made some of the most unforgettable scenes in the games. Each clash a compact story of skill and risk, balanced on the fragile edge between triumph and defeat. The organizers picked the kinds of fighters and the matchups as carefully as a playwright composes an act, arranging every tilt and twist to keep the crowd on edge. And the clashes were often underscored by trumpets and drums and the rising chorus of voices that made the arena feel alive. When the word gladiator is spoken, most people summon a bright, dusty arena, sand thrown up by quick steps, steel striking steel, men locked in a brutal contest under the sun. And yet among those figures there were also women, the gladiatrixes, who stepped into the same sand and stood beneath Rome's gaze. Their presence is not a modern fancy. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio Cassius each name women who fought, but their references flash and fade like brief lightning in a storm, leaving us to rebuild a shape from scattered lines and partial remains. Those ancient notices are uneven and often coy. They do not hand down neat life stories or fight records. Tacitus might pause to comment on the spectacle, Suetonius to tell an episode, Dio Cassius to pass on an anecdote. Each voice suggests that women took up arms, but none lingers on the details. We end up reading between lines that are themselves thin. Enough to insist that gladiatrixes existed, not enough to tell us how many there were, what their daily lives were like, or precisely how their bouts were governed. The evidence is fragmentary, and in the gaps the imagination rushes in, but we must resist inventing contests or champions where the sources offer only shadows. Even so, those shadows have sharp edges. A woman standing exposed in the arena, a sword raised, would jar against Roman expectations of femininity. In the public mind, courage and blood sports belonged to men, and women were supposed to occupy other roles. Yet some crossed that boundary, and their presence forced Romans to face an uncomfortable contradiction. The games could both reinforce social rules and tear them open. To watch a woman fight was to see gender performed as much as assigned, a sight that fascinated and scandalized contemporaries in equal measure. Scholars still argue about who these women were. Were they, like many male gladiators, slaves bought and trained until they fought at another's command? Or did some enter the arena by choice, perhaps even coming from free families or the aristocracy? The evidence points both ways. We can trace stories of women sold into training schools, their lives shaped by ownership and profit, and we can read other accounts of women who took up armor and spear of their own accord, using the arena as a way to win money, fame, or public standing, otherwise denied to them. That possibility, that some women chose the danger and the spectacle, changes how we think about options for women in Rome. Social life, there was not a single cage of rules, but a field of constrained openings and risky maneuvers. For a few, fighting could be a ladder, a way to be seen, to turn strength into payment and renown. For others, it might have been a deliberate flouting of decorum, an act meant to shock or to carve out a different identity. And for many, the truth was harsher. The blade was not advancement, but bondage. Enslaved women could be sold to trainers, marked by their profession, and forced into schools where life was cheap, and the crowd's appetite for novelty could be lethal. We cannot say how many gladiatrixes there were. The exact number has been swallowed by time. Stones and inscriptions give only hints, poems and histories only glimpses. Yet scarcity of detail does not make their existence any less striking. To have women participate in so public and violent a spectacle was a visible reversal of gender expectation, and for Romans raised on strict codes of behavior, female fighters became both a curiosity and, for some, an outrage. Part of that outrage came from how hard the sight was to fit into Roman prejudices. When writers described female warriors among foreign peoples like the Teutons and the Celts, they mixed fascination with moralizing disdain, painting those women as exotic and dangerous examples of barbarian disorder. Such references served less as neutral reporting than as a way to mark the boundary between Roman order and foreign otherness. In the literature and on the sands, female combatants were pulled into arguments about identity and control. Beneath the polemics and the scandal, though, there is a human scene. A woman, whether born free or bound, could stand in the glare of the amphitheater, her breath clouding in the heat, while the murmur swells and then breaks into a shout. The crowd lining forward as if a single instant might decide everything. At that moment she is not merely a symbol or a spectacle. She is a person shaped by choices, pressures, hopes, and fears. Whether she fought for money, for fame, or because necessity left her no other path, she took part in a ritual that exposed how fragile and changeable social roles could be. In the end, the story of the gladiatrixes remains unfinished. The ancient writers give us names and scraps, and from those fragments we can trace some outlines. Women fought, some were enslaved, and some were free, and their presence unsettled Roman sensibilities and echoed foreign models. But many particulars remain hidden. That uncertainty is part of what they leave behind. It calls on us to listen carefully to those thin voices from the past, and with restraint to imagine the lives that once stepped into the sand and answered the crowd's call. They moved through the city like living contradictions, bound and praised, condemned and celebrated, visible proof that a person could be both despised by law and desired by the crowd. Most were slaves, criminals, or prisoners taken in war, stripped of freedom and trained by men who made their living off other people's bodies and bravery. Still, When a favored fighter stepped into the light, the very same people who had no legal claim over him would roar in adoration. For a few heartbeats, the iron of their chains seemed to fall away, and the arena became a place where skill and courage could erase status. To the public, they turned into symbols: courage made flesh, strength performed for everyone to see, victory given a face. A handful escaped the anonymity of the barracks and became famous, their names chanted from the cheap seats to the outer tiers, their reputations clinging to them like armor. That public love could bring prizes and better treatment, attention that turned bruises into headlines and wounds into proof of legend. But that was the exception. For most, the calculation was immediate and brutal: how to survive the next match, how to fight for the chance to buy or win freedom, or simply how to live another day. Danger was not theater for them. It was a constant companion. Every time a man stepped into the sand, the clock of his life seemed to speed up. On average, a gladiator fought only once or twice a year, and those encounters were short and savage, often between nothing at all and 15 minutes. A single bout could condense a lifetime of training, hope, and dread into a handful of blows and the swing of a sword. Most did not get past 10 games. 10 entrances was often the point at which the ledger closed. Graves and the injuries written on bones make the truth blunt. Most gladiators did not live past 30. Experience might sharpen reflexes and sharpen a reputation, but it could not buy many extra years. The arena itself was sensory and immediate: the heat of sun on the skin, the dust and sweat tangling in the air, the metallic hint of blood and fear that seemed to hang over the amphitheater, the sudden hush before combat like a breath everyone was holding. Their lives were a constant negotiation between spectacle and survival, sold as entertainers, celebrated as warriors, yet always exploited by a system that turned their valor into amusement and political theater. They were icons, but icons who paid in flesh and in years. That paradox stretched beyond the sand. At the very top, the emperors who ruled Rome were vulnerable in their own way. Succession could be treacherous, court politics deadly, and an emperor's life was never assured. By some counts, there was about a 47.6% chance of dying violently. Reigns tended to be short, usually around 5 to 10 years. And if you translate that into the brutal terms of the arena, those years equate roughly to 10 to 20 gladiatorial fights. It's a stark comparison. Rulers and fighters alike lived under a precarious tally of risk and sudden ends. In the end, the gladiator's story is all contrasts. They were property and prodigy, victims and heroes, men who could be cheered in public and forgotten in private. Each entrance into the sand was a concentrated tableau of valor that might win applause or bury a life in sand. Applause did not mean safety, and fame did not promise longevity. Still, for a few, those brief, blazing minutes beneath the glare left a kind of immortality in memory, a reward that feels as paradoxical as it is tragic, for lives that history shows were often painfully short. They called him Flamma, and for 30 years the world watched him burn. He was never a quiet presence in the sand. From the first clang of iron to the last shout that rose from the stands, he moved like a living spark. Quick, bright, impossible to hold. 34 times he stepped into the arena. 34 times he met the test that crowds and fate laid before him. Each combat was a small life of its own, a flash and grit, a brief geometry of blades and shields, the sharp jolt of pain, the soft thud when a rival dropped to the dust. 34 beginnings and endings, each one leaving him marked and different. A map of scars and stories read by eyes that loved spectacle. He did not grow old gently. He lived to be 30, and in those decades he packed more drama and endurance than many do in a whole lifetime. His skin learned the sun baked over the open amphitheater. His lungs remembered the dry, hot roar of the audience. His hands understood the weight of instruments that could change a life in a single moment. Every victory and every narrow escape felt like a small triumph against the vast machinery that set the stage. The trainers, the rules, the hunger in the stands for something to be remembered. Flamma came to measure himself not by years, but by the number of combats, by the rhythm of the arena, and by the hush that fell when he readied himself. There was a stubbornness in him as bright as his name. On 4 separate occasions the world offered him release, the chance to step off that stage and into whatever peace might lie beyond. Each offer was a hinge toward another future. Each time he refused. Refusal has edges you can almost see. The steady focus in his eyes when a hand was offered, the deliberate turning away from an easier story. Whether it was pride or duty, the pull of the arena, or some private weight in his chest, he would not accept freedom. 4 times he turned away, and 4 times the arena held him fast. Think of Flamma as a life burned down to its essentials, brilliant, concentrated, decisive. 30 years, 34 fights, 4 refusals. Those are the numbers the world kept, but they hardly hold the height of a man who chose the ring again and again. In the memory of the crowds and the echo of clashing bronze, he remains unmistakable, a flame that kept its own terms until the end. Carpophorus made his name fighting wild beasts, and in one brutal contest he killed a bear, a lion, and a leopard. At the same time, though on a much larger stage, another kind of confrontation was taking shape. In 71 BC, under a sky that felt on the edge of change, Spartacus set off a slave revolt that spread like thunder across the Italian countryside. He became the center of a surge of people. Some 70,000 in all, ragged and fierce and driven by a single, impossible longing to be free. They came from quarries and farmhouses, from coastal towns and the forced workshops of Rome, carrying whatever could serve as weapon or armor. Nights were marked by bonfires and hastily dug trenches. By day they moved together, a force that was unpredictable and alive with both hope and fury. Opposite them, the Roman legions advanced with calm, terrible confidence, banners snapping in the wind, ranks locked into formation, their steel and discipline shaped by years of conquest. Where these 2 worlds met, the raw, pulsing desperation of the slave host and the cool, orderly might of Rome. The land itself held the memory of the clash in its stones and soil. Spartacus's uprising was more than a military challenge. It was a visible human outcry, the sound of marching feet fused with a deep, aching demand for dignity. The sun climbs slowly over a city made of stone and stories, and already the streets are moving toward the great oval of the amphitheater. People pour from every quarter, merchants with their goods still swung on carts, matrons shading their faces with scarves, barefoot children weaving between sandals, soldiers with dust baked into the folds of their cloaks. There's a tight, shared anticipation in the air. Not one private thrill, but something collective. A single held breath before a public pageant. Flags ripple and trumpets call, The amphitheater, a vast monument of stone and shadow at the city's center, promises spectacle and a kind of brutal clarity. Inside, life is arranged in tiers. Voices rise and fall with the groan of heavy gates and the steady thud of feet, the air thick with dust, citrus, sweat, and the sweet smell of honeyed wine and roasted nuts hawked along the aisles. From the cold, crowded upper seats, with a poor huddle for warmth to the lower rows smoothed by generations of elbows and cloaks, thousands focus on the same strip of light, the arena. Beneath banners that mark the day's occasion, lives and legends will be made and unmade in a handful of heartbeats. The gladiatorial games are not merely entertainment. They are the city's pulse shown in public. That hunger for spectacle crosses classes, but it is read differently by each spectator. For some, the games are a reprieve, a few hours' escape from cramped rooms, from taxes and unending work, where worries are suspended by the shimmer of a staged fight. For others, they are a lesson and an aspiration, demonstrations of courage, endurance, and the precise art of surviving under pressure. For emperors and wealthy sponsors, the games are a language of power. Money and artistry are poured into the events because spectacle speaks to a crowd in ways speeches cannot. It lets rulers appear generous, strong, and deserving of authority. Preparing for the games is part ritual, part theater. Processions weave through the city as music swells and officials march beneath laurel and pennants. Exotic animals arrive in cages, the muffled roar of a great cat, the heavy breathing of a creature unused to the city's clamor. The gladiators themselves are full of contrasts. Some are outsiders, hardened in barracks, built to train men to thrill and chill a crowd. Others are volunteers or those forced by debt, daring, or a hunger for glory that might carve their names into public memory. They stand at the threshold between life and death, sharpening blades, tightening straps, murmuring prayers, and thinking of whatever they fight for: honor, survival, the thin promise of fame. There is a solemnity beneath the pageantry, as if the whole show depends on an unspoken respect for the courage on display. When the gates swing open and combat begins, the amphitheater seems to breathe as one, and everything narrows to the sound of metal against leather and the roar of the crowd. In that narrowing moment, the spectacle does its most powerful trick. It turns danger into story. A final thrust, the pause before a charge, the way a beast circles. Each moment becomes part of a narrative replayed in the mind of every witness. People watch not only to see who falls, but to see how a person meets fate. Bravery is traded like coin. Children pick up the names and gestures of victory. Old men relive battles they never fought, and the city's myths are refreshed as heroes are made in a single afternoon. Those staged moments are political theater in the most literal sense. Emperors and magistrates who fund the games understand that popularity is about what people see and feel, not just applause. To present a day of games is to display wealth and capacity, the power to feed a crowd, to bring strange beasts, to maintain a building where law and order can be publicly affirmed, and where the ruler is shown as the giver of both spectacle and social cohesion. When an organizer offers grand games, they are sending a message. They can marshal resources, and they are generous enough to share them. That mix of power and largesse buys loyalty in a way speeches seldom do. In the crowd's roar, the sponsor hears praise and receives a kind of political currency. But the games are not only about rulers and the ruled. They are social theater where class and identity are performed and tested. From richly draped seats to the standing masses clinging to the upper rim, the city gathers under the same sky. For an hour or a day, rank softens as everyone braces together for a single story. A fight, a chase, a sudden silence that grips the whole arena. In that shared intensity, grievances fall silent and old alliances flicker back to life. People leave having seen the same images, having felt the same shocks of fortune, and that shared memory becomes a fragile social glue. There's another layer, too, something like religious release. Life in the city is precarious. Work demands attention. Food isn't guaranteed. The future is always uncertain. The amphitheater gives a public place to confront those fears, to watch decisive contests where outcomes are clear and symbolic. The violent scenes on the sand, the clash of muscle and steel, the struggle between man and beast, the finality of a fallen fighter. Allow a communal rehearsal of questions about mortality, valor, and fate. People go home for a time, less haunted by those questions, carrying a communal impression that the world has been ordered, if only for the afternoon. For those who stake their reputations on a well-staged show, sponsoring the games is an investment in memory. They arrange choirs and dancers to warm the crowd, lay out spoils and exotic animals to astonish, and choreograph contests with meticulous care to please and provoke. Successful games scatter favor like confetti. The sponsor's name travels from mouth to mouth, attached to moments of joy, fear, and wonder. In that context, generosity becomes social capital. To be a giver of games is to be named a pillar of civic life, to be repaid in what the people value most: cheers, loyalty, and a place in their stories. All the while, the spectacle ties itself to an idea of greatness. The amphitheater is a place where the city's power can be seen, felt, and applauded. There the ideals that back authority, discipline, courage, magnanimity, are acted out, sometimes in blood, but often in brilliant display. For a few hours, the audience takes part in a narrative centered on the city itself. Its ability to command an empire's resources, to bring distant beasts and foreign fighters onto its stage, and to shape public life, so that danger and grandeur meet under an open sky. When the day ends and the crowds spill back into the streets, the amphitheater breathes and the dust settles. The stories continue. Songs hum through the lanes. Children play at being champions with sticks for swords. Sponsors are praised or criticized at evening tables, and the gladiators who survive walk back through the gates, marked by both scars and promise. The games leave behind more than spilled blood. They leave a memory stamped onto the city's daily life, a living picture of what it means to belong to a community that gathers to watch itself defined, moment by dramatic moment, beneath that same sky. We usually picture a Roman emperor on a throne, wrapped in purple, the slow, deliberate weight of power around him. Yet in Rome's long story, a few of those rulers did something startling. They loosened that robe and walked down into the arena. They did not stand above the games as distant patrons. They joined the slaughter, laying their bodies and reputations bare where spectacle met mortal danger. Those moments were often astonishing, sometimes grotesque, and always revealing. Men who could command legions choosing instead to trade blows with trained fighters and be cheered or cursed by the very crowd whose favor they needed. Nobody fits that image more than Commodus. He became emperor in 180 AD, and almost every contemporary account settles on the same disturbing picture: a man who preferred armor and a club to council and senate. Ancient writers, their pages full of moral outrage, loved to tell of him striding into the arena dressed as a living Hercules, a lion's pelt thrown across his shoulders, a heavy wooden club in his hands, every gesture exaggerated and staged. Behind that bravado were contests arranged to flatter him, opponents ordered to kneel, weapons blunted, victories scored like a performer keeping tally. Even so, the sight of an emperor brandishing a blade and cutting down beasts and men under the stadium sun felt like a degradation of the office. Some reports even count his appearances by the hundreds, a number that may be literal, or maybe the dramatic way critics tallied his thirst for the crowd's roar. The reasons went beyond vanity. To rule Rome, you needed awe as much as fear, and standing in the sand before tens of thousands let an emperor turn authority into something immediate and physical. People saw him bloodied and unbowed, a living symbol who had done what ordinary men might not. But there was a politics to that theater. Senators looked on with shame and alarm. The aristocracy found itself laughing at and terrified by a ruler who preferred applause to the council that had once defined imperial dignity. For some, the spectacle proved the emperor had stepped outside acceptable bounds. For others, it was simply power staged in the most direct way imaginable. Commodus is the clearest example, but he was not alone in using staged violence or athletic display to project rule. Later emperors liked to be cast as warriors, on statues, on coins, in public imagery, even if they rarely descended to the fighting pits. Some showed up in gladiatorial dress in sculpture, or minted it into metal. Others trained publicly in wrestling, boxing, and horsemanship, letting their bodies tell the story their words polished. For the people in the seats, a leader who shared the danger felt thrilling and intimate. Seeing an emperor sweat and strain created a strange closeness to power. For the elite, those same scenes were a warning, a sign that old boundaries were shifting and that spectacle could rewrite what counted as respectable. Step into one of those amphitheaters and the scene hits the senses. Sun bleaching the marble tiers, the sharp scent of sand mixed with animal blood, the crowd's roar rising and collapsing in waves that could lift a man into triumph or crush him with silence. From the imperial lodge a figure descends, still robed, but robed to be unrobed, muscles taut under the glare, a helmet flashing, a club raised. The crowd's shout becomes a kind of currency, convertible into fortune, fear, or infamy. In that sand, the emperor is several things at once: performer, gladiator, demagogue, symbol, and the applause that fed an emperor's ego could also feed the grudges and plots that would one day end him. What links these episodes is not just the spectacle itself, but what it discloses about Rome's political drama. Emperors who took on the gladiator's role were testing the bond between power and performance, showing how an office could be both strengthened and undermined in the glare of public display. The arena erased distance and made rule feel immediate, and in doing so it altered, sometimes irrevocably, what it meant to be emperor in Rome's shifting story. Commodus is one of the emperors most notoriously associated with the gladiatorial ring. He ruled from 111 to 192 AD, and according to sources like the historian Cassius Dio, delighted in appearing dressed as a gladiator and fighting other fighters or even wild animals. That behavior, however, didn't sit well with everyone. Many saw emperors taking the sword as a breach of dignity, a step away from the office they were supposed to embody. Herodian gives us the next, darker chapter. Between 211 and 217 AD, Caracalla, ruler of an empire that spanned continents, sometimes left the marble halls and walked straight into the heart of Rome's spectacles. Herodian fixes a striking picture. The emperor not perched above the crowd, but standing in the sun-baked arena, sand underfoot, sweat in the air, with gladiators and beasts all around him, on afternoons when the city's hunger for spectacle ran high. The amphitheater thrummed with sound, voices rising and falling, banners snapping in the heat, the crowd pressing in on every tier. Into that charged space, Herodian tells us Caracalla stepped. He did more than watch. He fought, locking shields with gladiators, trading blows, and at times facing the raw danger of beasts dragged into the ring. The image is both theatrical and unsettling, the ruler as combatant, his figure stark against the pale sand, while fighters closed in and animals prowled. These were not secret rehearsals behind closed doors. They were staged for everyone, moments when the emperor's worth was counted in strikes and parries, and when his courage was metered by applause or a sudden gasp. For Caracalla, the arena did double duty. It entertained the city with brutal, immediate drama, and it offered a calculated display of physical power. By stepping into the ring, he became more than a face on a coin or a name on a decree. He was a living proof of strength, standing shoulder to shoulder with Rome's trained fighters and facing the perils the crowds loved to see. What Herodian records is more than a list of combats. It's a portrait of a ruler who understood spectacle as a language. In the heat of the amphitheater, amid cheers and blood, Caracalla's actions spoke plainly and forcefully, reshaping how people perceived him and bolstering his standing in the eyes of many. The arena, in those years from 211 to 217 AD, became a stage on which he bound his image to courage and danger. The sun was already blistering the arena dust when the final thrust fell silent, and the crowd's roar thinned to a single held breath. It was then that a darker procession took shape. The men who stepped forward to carry away the fallen were not merely attendants at their work, but participants in a deliberate, chilling ritual. They were dressed as a god of death, an image meant to give the moment more weight than the simple loss of flesh. In that staging, the amphitheater's endgame was made plain. The combat had stripped a man of life and reached for something beyond what the eye could see. Seeing those figures move among scattered weapons and darkening blood, spectators felt that what left the sand was not only a still body, but a soul being led away under divine custody. The gesture tightened the air, grief folding into awe, spectacle becoming something like sacrament, and the everyday brutality of the games, if only for a breath, turning into an encounter with fate. They often took the shape of Dis Pater, the Roman ruler of the dead, a name that carried the weight and mystery of the underworld, and that made gladiatorial bloodshed feel darker and more final. When someone spoke Dis Pater's name in that hush, after footsteps had trampled a space or a coffin slipped into the ground, it did more than point to a Roman realm of the dead. It summoned a whole theater of shadowed figures, masks, and borrowed faces gathered at the edge of grief. Alongside the old Latin god, other presences would step forward, not just in marble or painted walls, but in the living flesh of people dressed to be other. Slaves, usually small and silent, were sometimes turned into living embodiments of otherworldly powers, arrayed and costumed, so that for a moment they stopped being ordinary, and for the watching crowd became something older and vaster. A procession moved forward under wavering torchlight, censers sending perfume and smoke into the night. Among the mourners there would be a figure whose head was not quite human, the long-snouted silhouette of a jackal made real. This was Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian of tombs and mummification, the one said to steady the scales of fate. Foreign gods were always translated here into human terms. The jackal's ears and snout became a worn mask, the slave inside a costume borrowing the authority of that god. The animal mask framed the bearer's face, painted eyes caught the torchlight, and in that borrowed guise, the slave became a mediator between living and dead, an uncanny presence standing at the threshold. Not far off, a darker shape might loom, Charon from old Etruscan hills, drawn in blunt, uncompromising strokes on tomb walls and sarcophagi, a demonic sentinel of the underworld, where Anubis suggested careful rite and the gentle ordering of souls. Charun was the heavier guardian, the one who kept the boundary and warned the living away. When slaves were marshaled into these roles, cloaked, masked, their features hidden, they became walking reminders of mortality's many faces. Cloaked in costume, they could evoke distant myths and geographies, bringing the images of Egypt and Etruria into the streets and funerary rites of other lands. There is a particular poignancy in watching a living person compelled to wear a mask that signifies power over death, in seeing someone move with the restraint of a ritual that must not be broken. The jackal head tilts in practiced gesture. The Etruscan demon's shadow stretches across the paving stones. For the crowd, for the length of a lament or the slow beat of a drum, these figures were not just theater, but sacrament, a ritual language spoken in cloth and face. The sight of an Anubis or a Charun made by human hands shows how ancient peoples borrowed and reshaped one another's gods and monsters, how cultural boundaries softened where the need to name and face death was strongest. Listen to what those dressed bodies meant. There is an economy of meaning in making a slave into a god's image. Humility became spectacle. Servitude became a canvas for communal myth. The masks and robes did not erase the person beneath, but they layered another truth over them, one the living could read as ritual necessity. Anubis, jackal-headed and tied to embalming and funerary rites, offered a comforting, ordered passage. Charun, grim and guarding the underworld, served as a harsher warning and restraint. Both, in human terms, performed the same essential service. They gave forms to fear, made the invisible visible, and let communities walk for a time, with guides and obstacles between life and whatever came next. In the end, those images, pulled from the myths of the Nile or the rock-cut tombs of Etruria, folded into the wider mourning. Dispeter's name lingered in Latin prayers, but the spectacle around it borrowed faces and gestures from a larger world, so grief could be spoken in many tongues. The slaves who wore jackal heads, or the stolid masks of underworld guardians moved slowly beneath torches and sky, human bodies carrying the heavy dignity of myth. For those who watched, for those who heard the scrape of sandals and the low intoning of ritual, those borrowed faces felt as solemn and necessary as any carved effigy. A simple, terrible truth made visible. To honor the dead, people will call upon whatever figures seem able to hold back the dark, even if those figures must be worn for a moment by hands that otherwise know only labor and silence. The dead gladiators were dragged out through the Porta Libitinensis, the gate that carried the name of Libitina, the Roman goddess who oversaw funerals and burial rites and whose very name was bound up with death and mourning. Sending the fallen out that way made their exit more than practical. It turned it into a symbol, a final passage marking the end of their lives and the movement from the arena into whatever lay beyond. They were never just performers on a stage. When slaves were dressed as gods of death, their arrival on the sand changed the whole tenor of the games. Cloaked figures were set to embody forces the crowd could not control, and they moved through the roar like warnings, their masks and gestures rehearsed to summon what people preferred not to think about. The sight of those staged bodies, the masks, the deliberate poses, the ritualized motions, folded the notion of mortality into every thrust of a blade and every grind of leather against leather. Spectators did more than watch. In the tight rhythm of the bouts, they were made to feel that they stood at the edge of something relentless and inevitable. That feeling was compounded by the constant echo of Libitina and the underworld. Her name lingered among the crowd like a low, persistent murmur, whether called out in ceremony or simply imagined. Her presence threw a gravity over the spectacle that no shout or cheer could quite lift. The games, therefore, ran on two levels at once. They satisfied the hunger for violence and skill, and they acted as a communal facing of death. Every clash of metal carried with it the larger question of what lay under the noise of life. When those strands came together, the ritual gods of death on the sand, and the gate that meant burial, the arena became a place of equal parts awe and dread. People came not just for entertainment, but to witness a ritual that acknowledged how fragile a human life could be. Laughter would burst out, bets were settled, and games played on. Yet beneath these surface currents there was a steady, sober recognition that what everyone watched was tied to endings. The spectacle was never simply about prowess. At its heart it was a public negotiation with mortality, acted out in broad daylight, so every spectator might go home, having, for a brief season, seen the face of what waits for us all.